Elden Ring has no shortage of unique and interesting weapons to play with some incredibly creatively designed shields that can double as threatening blunt objects, imaginative spells that inspire both fear and wonder, as in I wonder how they designed something so bad, and a huge amount of your garden variety handheld attacking tools. There's a playstyle for just about anybody who dares to pick this game up. But there's one weapon class that's so uniquely terrible that you rarely hear about it. A tool that's useful, but was never really designed to be a playstyle in and of itself. The humble crossbow. Now don't get me wrong, this thing has its uses. They're relatively light and don't require much in the way of stat investment, so if you need some kind of ranged option for the rare situations where your normal weapon just won't cut it, then a crossbow can come in clutch. And outside of the 2 crossbows that fire multiple bolts at a time for status building, that's really the only niche that they are able to fill. About 2 years ago, I embarked on a challenge to gather all great runes in the game using Elden Ring's absolute worst crossbow, the Soldier's Crossbow. This thing's damage is so low that I'm convinced that Miyazaki himself included it as a joke. And while most low-damage things can be somewhat improved by the existence of stat scaling in these games, crossbows don't have that luxury. It doesn't matter what kind of crossbow or what kind of bolt you use, the damage it deals will never get any better outside of reinforcing it. You can't add Ashes of War, you can't add special affinities for status effects, and on top of that, you have to manually reload after every single shot, inevitably burning some of your precious attack windows just to be able to fire another shot next time. As bad as this weapon is, I was able to become the Elden Lord as a naked dual crossbow user. But now, the DLC is here, and basically every boss in this expanded experience puts to shame the bosses that exist in the base game. So, how will this weak, clunky waste of wood fare in the Shadowlands? Let's find out. You know, I don't know why I did this not once, but twice, but just like with my Shield Challenge character, I made the extremely unwise choice of having sent this character into New Game Plus at some point after I did the original challenge run. Unfortunately, I didn't really do anything at all this time around, and I basically had to do everything again, up to and including defeating Mohg and Radahn. So after a quick tour of the world, participating in Vare's fetch quest, and killing more than one unnecessary boss because I completely forgot the trigger to Radahn's festival, I managed to reach and defeat both Mohg and Radahn, though not exactly in that order. It only took about 2 hours, even with the unnecessary kills, which isn't too bad, and it was at least a great way to refresh myself on this playstyle. As usual, the first thing to do when entering the DLC is to collect as many Shadow Tree fragments as I can get my grubby little hands on. There's actually a lot of fragments that are available to you without ever killing a boss, and even more without ever touching a Remembrance boss, but in the interest of keeping things reasonably challenging, I'm only going to pick up the fragments in Gravesite Plain for now, which is enough to get straight up to Blessing level 5. I also don't even consider the possibility of killing the Furnace Golem wandering around this area, partially because I don't think there's any new physic tier that I'd want to use for this challenge, but mostly because not only do these crossbows deal pretty abysmal damage, but I've never scored a knockdown with these crossbows. If they deal stance damage, it's not enough to counteract its own lack of speed. And even if they could knock down one of these sentient bonfires, these things can't crit anyway. And since these golems can't be poisoned, it would be a long fight for no real gain. I ignore these for the entirety of this run. It's not too long before I find my way to the top of Bellerat and at the door of the first boss, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. Despite not being the biggest fan of this boss or its moveset, I feel pretty confident going in. After all, I remember this run was surprisingly easy, due in large part to the fact that I can usually maintain a pretty safe distance from most of the bosses, and then punish them in situations that other weapons simply can't take advantage of because of the amount of range that I'm able to maintain. Confidence doesn't exactly erase the lack of experience or comfortability of dodging a boss though, and my hubris got the best of me and I died. This is a difficult DLC after all, and even though I'm getting hit really hard by the boss, I want to stay naked for as long as possible. But aside from looking damn good, Having my cheeks flapping in the wind is useful for more than just getting laid. It also helps keep my attack power up. And no, that's not a euphemism. Early on in the run of the original game, I decided to gather the Blue Dancer Charm, which gives me more attack power the lower my equip weight is. With my equip weight around 10, being naked grants me both around 12 to 13% more damage and 19% more phone numbers. Between that and the Arrow's Sting Talisman, the Crossbows damage is raised from abysmal to simply terrible. But the obvious weakness is that my skin is soft and easily bruised. I expected at least one death here though, and I was at least able to keep it at just one. I was right to be a little confident too, because even though this lobster-looking lion has a few gap closers, he doesn't like to use them very often. It's not too difficult to keep dancing around mid-range of the boss's reach, and with so much distance and cowardly backwards rolls, the boss's attacks are easier to avoid than ever in both phases. This thing's size makes it pretty easy to land a shot despite its wiggliness too, and after nearly 7 minutes of running away and shooting and trying to make sure this thing stays poisoned, it goes down. And I'm glad. I still haven't learned this boss's moves very well, and I think I'm quite alright putting it off for just a bit longer. Next up, I head to Castlensis and rush through as quickly as possible, stopping only to bully the locals and discovering that karma really does exist. No! I make it through, and then before taking on Rolana, I step back outside to grab the Spelldrake Talisman +3, and then I get to work. Rolana's not the most difficult boss in the world, but she does have one thing going for her that no other non-NPC boss in this DLC does. She can dodge projectiles. Of course, this drags the fight out, but she's not very difficult to bait into a move, and once she's swinging away on the other side of the arena, that's the perfect time to gift her one of my poison dip bolts. Poison her once, bolt her into phase 2, poison her again, and then proceed to die because you got punished literally every time you tried to heal. You know, just another Tuesday. Really, the only interesting thing about this fight is that she can dodge. Other than that, it's just me trying to bait her into doing something stupid so I can attack freely. Mostly just running in circles and hoping for the best. After 8 minutes, she finally goes down, and we can move on to Shadow Altus to collect all of its goodies. Unlike my shield-only run, this run is extremely limited in what I'm allowed to use. I'm stuck with these awful crossbows, and there's not much new that I'm able to gather to help me out. There is one thing though, and this happens to be the perfect time to collect it. By traveling west after exiting Rolana's boss arena, you can drop your way down to a somewhat hidden place called the Fog Rift Fort. I'm here for something specific, but I somehow managed to stumble into a part of this fort that I had completely missed in my previous runs. Seriously, I've never fought this Yoshi boss before, and whatever goofy crucible spell he's using would have been absolutely perfect for my Mario run. And he also drops a shield that I could have grabbed for my shield run, but from what it seems it's kinda crap anyway, so no love lost there. But the reason that I'm actually here is at the top of one of these towers, the Arrow's Soaring Sting Talisman. This talisman combines the effect of the Arrow's Sting Talisman, which increases bow and bolt damage by 10%, and the Arrow's Reach Talisman, which increases the effective range of arrows and bolts by 65%, only it's slightly weaker at 8% damage and 50% reach. Not too bad of a compromise for saving a talisman slot, and since it stacks with the Sting, this is a straight-up damage upgrade as long as I'm wearing both, which I do for most of this run, starting now. With my newfound ever so slightly higher than normal damage, it's time to take on the Golden Hippo. This boss is pretty simple and I enjoy fighting it, but it turns out that the quills he spews in phase 2 are not the easiest thing in the world to avoid. More often than not, at least one of the quills will end up hitting me from either his quill rain or his quill burst. I'm not quite sure how to properly dodge these, and I also kept getting hit by both his charge attack and his sonic spin move. And those things don't hit especially hard, but with such low damage per second from me and getting squeezed out of all of my flasks, I still die to a poorly timed roll at a heartbreaking percentage.
No!
One quick death later, and we're on the winning attempt. It's still a lot closer than I'd like it to be though. I wish I could say that most of the damage came from failing to properly dodge difficult to avoid quills, but no, I just don't quite have the dodge timings down properly for this boss yet and kept taking hit after unnecessary hit. perfectly avoidable, but not by me apparently. Still, it's barely not enough to bring me down, and I squeeze by with a win after about 7.5 minutes. I head out of the castle's secret entrance to find some of this hippo's family for some sweet, sweet revenge, and then make a very wrong choice in Leda and Hornson's quest line. A quick jaunt through the nearby storehouse, and it's time to fight Mesmer. Nope. You know, after my last run, I kind of thought that I understood this guy, but clearly not. I'm pretty good at dodging his normal combos, at least most of the time. But the 2 attacks where he goes airborne and flies around like a tornado in California after a gender reveal party kept destroying me. After a few attempts, I decided that I needed some more fire resist, go find the Fire Drake +3 talisman, and then get back to work. An hour and a half later, I've reached Phase 2 exactly 1 time. It's safe to say that this is where the run really started to get difficult. Between Rolana and the Divine Beast going down so easily, I was sort of expecting things to proceed similarly as I went deeper into the game, but nope. Mesmer doesn't leave a lot of openings to safely take a shot. Remember, shooting a crossbow is surprisingly slow. You'd think I could just hip fire it and be fine, but no. It's slower than most weapons in this game. It takes quite a long time before you even have the ability to roll out of the animation, slower than even swinging a thrusting shield, to my surprise. That means that the main puzzle here is figuring out which attacks are safe to shoot through and when I can squeeze in a reload. And remember, reloading the crossbow is somehow faster than actually shooting it. I don't understand. Miyazaki, please fix. But even after figuring out that I can get 2 sweet shots off after he throws his spear, and learning that he's skinny enough to accidentally avoid some of my bolts, I was still getting bodied by those spin attacks. Badly. Something in my brain broke with those attacks, and I just couldn't figure out how to dodge them. So after doing a little bit of research and hitting a new farming spot to restock on Poison Bloom so I can keep a steady supply of poison bolts flowing, I decided to head back to the lands between for a bit of a collectathon. First, I go and collect a crafting cookbook and then spend way too long gathering sunflowers to craft some Haligbone bolts, only to realize that I've wasted my time and could just buy better holy bolts straight from this merchant for just a few runes. I then commit merchant for their bell bearings and then head back to Mesmer. Much to my frustration, though, these holy bolts turn out to do less damage than the normal bolts, despite Mesmer's 0 holy resist. I just wasted a bunch of time for nothing. Yay. It makes me wonder why these elemental bolts even exist. It seems that because of the way split-type defense works in this game, and the crossbow's complete lack of damage scaling, even with elemental damage, all of the elemental bolts wind up being strictly worse than normal bolts of the same quality. Unless an enemy has negative resist, which is super rare. At the very least, they can be backup bolts if I ever run out of normal bolts, but man, it's surprising just how worthless these are. Anyway, that revelation was enough for me to nope right out of this fight. I've been stuck on Mesmer for a while now, but it's not like I have to be. There's plenty more to explore, so I decided to say goodbye to the mama's boy for now, and head south for bluer pastures. Mesmer is a tricky man, but there's so much more to this DLC, so it's time to head off the beaten path to find some other bosses for a bit of a change of pace. I teleport back to the front of Castellensis and then head south to the Dragon's Pit to evict this man from his home and unlock the southern portion of the map. I immediately head to Karo's hidden grave for more hot and heavy hippo revenge, and then grab more fragments in the Cerulean coast before diving into the fissure and making my way down to the putrescent Knight. Of all the bosses in this DLC, this is actually the fight that I was most looking forward to a rematch with. That's mostly because in my shield run, I realized how powerful a projectile is in this fight, where the boss spends most of his time running in circles around you. What I didn't realize at the time, though, is that the throwing shield's projectile speed and homing properties are absolutely insane. This crossbow, on the other hand, has neither of those properties. What I thought was going to be consistent and reliable damage turned out to be quite the opposite. Anytime the boss is moving even a little bit perpendicular to me, I have basically no chance to land a shot. I'm basically stuck doing damage in the same windows that I would if I had a melee weapon. because that's when he's most still. Except because of where the lock-on point is on his weirdly shaped body, a lot of these shots wind up missing as this thing's body contorts during its animations. And after about 5 minutes, this was the best I could muster. It's not exactly bad, but it's not exactly good either. My ability to hit the boss is worse than a melee character, and at this rate, the fight is going to take 15 minutes for a boss that doesn't even have a particularly high amount of health. After a couple more attempts, though, I started to internalize how this boss moves. One of this guy's favorite attacks is a simple pair of drive-by swipes. This is normally a decent window for any character to do a bit of damage, but most of the time if I fire, the bolt is just going to completely miss. But I realized that the boss moves in a straight line immediately after the swipe. I figured out that if I roll sideways into the boss at the perfect angle, I'll be lined up perfectly with the boss so that his movement won't dodge my shot. The Putrescent Knight loves this move, so figuring out how to punish it was a huge step in making this fight go just a little more quickly. I also found a small window to get a punish during the horse attack. Didn't always work, but some is better than none, right? Between the normal melee openings and discovering these 2 new opportunities, I got into the groove, weaving through the boss's blade and punishing it at every opportunity. Unfortunately, I was too greedy and ran out of Estus, but that's nothing another good solid attempt won't cure, and sure enough, the Putrescent Knight goes down after a long 11.5 minutes. This fight went so opposite of what I expected that I was starting to question things. If this boss provided such a uniquely difficult situation for this weapon, how difficult will the rest of the bosses be? Am I ready? Will I even be able to take them out? No use dwelling on the future, there's gamer girl bathwater to drink, and I'm happy to imbibe. And with the Fisher finished, it's time to take a quick trip to the Finger Ruins to reenact that one scene from Season 3 of The Boys. If you know, you know. And then I climb my way up the windy crags of the Jagged Peak to fight Baal the Dread. After a bit of calibration, let's call it, I'm able to find the groove of the fight. The main challenge is finding a rhythm for the reloads and for the shots, and once I get a good handle on what I can and can't get away with, I start making some real progress. It turns out that despite the poor damage, ranged attacks are a pretty good option against Baal. It's pretty easy to find an opportunity to shoot with how big he is, and the lock-on point is often at center mass, which makes it pretty simple to line up a shot. Phase 2 is really what messed me up in this fight though. It seems that most of these bosses have 1 or 2 attacks that I just can't wrap my head around, and Baal is no exception. Most of his big explosions aren't much of a problem for me, but 2 of them just keep forcing me to take damage. The first is his flying fireball attack that he uses during his transition and to occasionally troll me during Phase 2. I guess the angle that I choose to run here isn't super safe, because sometimes the shots will still hit me and cause me to fall into a damage spiral. The second is his laser nuke, which feels like it has some extremely tight and specific dodge timings that I couldn't ever confidently nail down. I've looked at some other challenge runs since I did this fight, and I think if I just keep running perpendicular to the second laser, it's much easier to dodge the explosion, but at the time I didn't know that. With those wearing me down, my first good attempt ended after 11 minutes. The next attempt was 11.5 minutes and dying because I ran out of healing, and finally, the next attempt was able to defeat Baal in just under 11 minutes, with 5 flasks remaining in the bank. This was a pretty long and tiring fight, but I really felt the learning over the course of these attempts. Each run made me deadlier and more precise with both my attack and my defense, and it felt great to weave through the boss's moves and stick a bolt right into his chin, and there's just something inherently badass about defeating a massive dragon with dual crossbows. I can't move on from this fight quite yet though, because I just have to talk about how impossibly annoying fire is in this game. Elden Ring introduces you to this menace pretty early on with Godric and his dragon arm, but this has been consistently the most annoying thing to deal with. The problem is that fire is it's just stupid. It can bounce off of the weirdest things in a way that fire really shouldn't be capable of, and produce some absolutely baffling moments like this one. What? I've never been so happy to capture something on camera. I always knew this fire was completely busted, but this is such a perfect demonstration of how truly awful it can be. I hope this clip makes some of you feel as vindicated as I did when I captured it. Anyway, let's move on because it's time to head through the church district, through the other half of the storehouse, and try to vindicate another set of people because the next boss we're going to fight is Commander Gaius, who is a rather boring individual.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
All right, jeez, I'm sorry. God. Anyway, this is Commander Gaius, a sort of fun-sized version of Radon from the base game. Similar gravity magic, similar phase 2, just smaller. And also probably a little more frustrating because of one super annoying move of his, the boar charge. This attack of his has such a seemingly tight window to properly dodge it, but luckily I'm a nudist, and that gives me light rolls which also give me just a little bit more distance to make it through this dangerous attack. So it's a little less tight for me and easier for me to squeak by. That doesn't completely stop me from getting hit by this attack, but at the very least it doesn't completely ruin my life. In fact, my main problem is that I just don't really know how to fight this guy. In my first playthrough, I just kind of brute forced my way through him, and in my shield run, I pretty much just blocked everything this guy threw my way. No learning required. And now, here I am, skin fully exposed and cheeks flapping in the breeze, not knowing how to dodge this guy's attacks. And the first few attempts here quickly show off the lack of experience. Most of Gaius' attacks are pretty simple to dodge. Just a normal little guy doing normal little guy swings, no big deal. Occasionally, he'll catch me taking a shot though, which is pretty normal considering how slow this crossbow truly is. As much as I'm learning these fights in more detail, I'm also learning exactly how much I can get away with as far as attacking goes, and naturally, that sees me overstepping some boundaries and getting my skull caved in by an angry pig's hind legs. I also have to be extremely careful not to be too reckless, because unfortunately for everybody who plays this game, there doesn't seem to be much of a minimum range to Gaius' board charge attack. I don't think he can do it when he's directly in your face, but sometimes he will start it when you're still close enough to have a conversation with your inside voices, and it can very easily catch you off guard with how quickly it comes out. But by far his most intimidating attack is his longer combo, which takes me a while to find a proper dodge pattern for. Eventually, I figured out that dodging through the boar's attacks will keep me pretty safe from Gaius' lance, and the final attack will just miss me altogether, which allows me to sink a couple of bolts into his backside. Unfortunately, that gamer lean that Gaius has over the front of his board means that occasionally a shot at his back will completely miss. A little annoying, but not too big of a deal. With that combo figured out though, the fight feels very doable. I still have to stress about the board charge attack though, since it still hits me way more often than I'd like and is the main cause of most of the damage that I take. Fortunately, there's not much to say about Phase 2. Everything new he gets is pretty simple to dodge. The main thing to watch out for is his new gravity orb, but as long as I make sure I don't stand too close, then this won't happen. A few attempts later and I'm doing well, at least until I run out of flasks about 7.5 minutes into the fight with 20% of the boss's health remaining, which led to an incredibly tense few minutes as I clenched every muscle I had and turned the sweat on as high as it could possibly go, resulting in probably the worst noise I've ever made after defeating a boss. Gaius is done, but even though that sound I made represents a massive amount of relief, there's little to truly celebrate. Despite the 5 new Shadow Tree fragments I gained from winning this fight, this run is not gonna get any easier. Gaius is toast, so now it's time to open up the secret tunnel behind the Marika statue to collect a tuft of hair from the shaman village and take a visit to Fingertown to this for a and these for a. I tell the guy over at the Finger Church what I did, and I guess I kind of offended him because next time I came back, he was missing. So I dove into the hole beneath his chair to fight the Mother of Fingers, and I really wish I hadn't. Meter is a weird boss in more ways than one. Of course, there's the obvious, the eldritch horror that is a sentient mass of writhing fingers that shoots lasers and gives birth to baby hands on a regular basis. But there's also the less obvious with the strangely abnormal attacks that she has. Most of them are pretty easy to avoid, but Phase 2 is home to 2 attacks that gave me an endless amount of trouble. She gives birth as early as Phase 1 though, and I don't have the confidence to ignore them while continuing to attack the boss, so I take the time to kill the babies as soon as they come out. It only takes 2 shots per little hand, so 6 in total, which isn't too bad. And she doesn't do this very often, at most 2 or 3 times per attempt in my experience. It could have been so much worse. At around 60%, she'll cause a very difficult to dodge explosion, which I think I only managed to avoid a single time, but it only does half my health and damage and leaves me with a huge window to heal, so it's not that big of a deal. There's 2 main problems for me to keep in mind for this phase though, and the first is her Beyblade attack where she floats up, spins, and then crashes down. Maybe I'm just brain broken or something, but I could not figure out the proper timing for this. I wasn't able to notice any visual or auditory cues to keep me safe, but in the game's defense, maybe the better option is to just run as far away as possible to avoid her on the ground instead of trying to avoid her crash landing. The other problematic attack is her spinning death laser. Along with Radahn's cross/combo, this laser has been found to be undodgeable by the wider community outside of very specific Ashes of War. Eventually, I just resigned myself to taking a hit from this attack, but before I accepted defeat, I tried a few different ways to avoid it. And on my 3rd attempt, I discovered that it's actually kind of bugged.
What?
Yeah, so under normal circumstances, this laser will deal about half of my health and damage. That is, if I let it knock me down in dramatic fashion. But it seems that there's a specific spot where if you dodge roll into it, the laser will hit you multiple times and completely delete your health bar. It's not cool that this attack is undodgeable in the first place, but it's even more not cool that this one shot happens. Anyway, it's a few more attempts until I just completely stop trying to avoid this attack, and I just start running straight into the first laser. On the bright side, the second laser is avoidable with good positioning, allowing me to either clean up some baby fingers or shoot at the boss as it slowly descends back into fighting position. If these were the only instances where I took damage in this fight, I think I could have cleared it pretty quickly. But unfortunately, I let the frustration and tension drag me down, and I took stray hits in between all the other really dangerous attacks. It doesn't help either that the baby fingers add an extra layer of stress while they're out, and this arena isn't nearly as infinite as it might seem. I don't understand why From has to put invisible walls in these arena types that only show up when you approach their edge, but they're super annoying, and you're not warned about them until you're already bumping into them. They also negatively affect the boss's movement at times, causing some unexpected results and maybe even causing you to take some unexpected hits. My frustration in this fight was very high, caused mostly by the fact that I felt like I was placed on a timer due to the undodgeable laser and my inability to dodge the Beyblade. But finally, after over an hour of attempts and only an 8-minute fight, felt like much longer, meter meets her maker and I can move on. Next up, I head down to the Darklight dungeon, and surprisingly, the crossbow put in some work against this area's boss. Jory likes to stand still most of the time, so as long as I get a moment to take a shot between all the summon spam, I'm able to squeeze in some pretty reliable damage. The fight is annoying, but I don't think that this fight is ever going to be super fun. I trudge my way through the Abyssal Woods and invade Mitra's home, just to nope right out of that situation after just a few attempts. Sometimes you're just not feeling it, and this is one of those times. Since I wasn't overly excited to take on Midra, I decided to finally head back to Mesmer. Since the last time I was here, I watched some YouTube videos showing this fight off, and I came to the conclusion that I was massively overcomplicating this fight. I was overall doing the fight pretty decently, but generally kept getting destroyed by his 2 swirly combos. Something about the way they're animated made me think that there was a more complicated way to dodge them, but really all you gotta do is dodge twice. Specifically for the combo where he starts stabbing you a lot with spears and then jumps up and then explodes the ground with more spears, I just needed to delay my second dodge so that I can position myself where he ends up. It still took a while and I was still getting hit by the boss's attacks, but eventually Mesmer went down just like the rest of them. I take another trip to Jarburg to restock on Poison Bloom and then head to the ruins of Rao, where I declare this specific species of hippo extinct and climb my way up towards Romina. Poison is a pretty interesting status effect. It's not particularly powerful, and in my run of the original game I ran some numbers against Rykard and found out that 3 applications of poison amounts to about 22% of the boss's health. That stat will change a bit depending on the maximum health of a boss, but not by a whole lot. 22% over 3 applications, which takes its course over a total of 4.5 minutes. It may not be a whole lot, but when I'm dealing not a lot of damage in the first place, it can be a real lifesaver of an ability. It makes the fight go by roughly 20% faster, and it's a great way to keep the damage going when I'm otherwise distracted by dodging or, reloading. I bring all this up because Romina is completely immune to poison. She's not the first boss with this immunity. That allocate belongs to the Putrescent Knight, but she does have nearly double the health and exists in a much more dangerous part of the game. And if the amount of time it took to defeat her is any indication, then she's surprisingly much more difficult than I ever gave her credit for. By most accounts, Romina seems to be more style than substance for most people. She looks both cool and horrifying in equal measure, and has some absolutely wild animations that cause her to twist and writhe endlessly, which can make it pretty hard to read her attacks. FromSoft seems to have understood this though, and what surprised me was just how readable her attacks actually are. Outside of her more basic attacks, I never really had an opportunity to figure out how to fight Romina for real, because she usually dies pretty easily. Not this time though. Not this time. 2 hours. Romina took me just over 2 hours to defeat. That's a far cry from originally considering her to be one of the easiest bosses in the DLC. I guess my previous disrespect has come back to bite me, because this was quite a grind that I wasn't expecting in the slightest. One of the biggest challenges of this fight is her lock-on point. It sits pretty high up at where I assume her human stomach would be, and if you've been paying attention, then you already know what I'm about to say. Romina may be thick where it counts, but she's got a tiny waist, and that tiny waist means a lot of my bolts fly right past her, unless I take the time to properly line up my shots and fire at the right moment of her animations. That's where the biggest time sink of this fight came in. There's of course always the delicate dance of figuring out what I can get away with in these fights, but here I also have to find the proper timing in her animations to even have a chance of dealing damage at all. I experimented with so many approaches and ranges, and what I eventually ended up with was a mix between medium and short range. I try my best to stay at medium range just so I could stay away from most attacks and bait her 2-swipe gap closing combo. She does this move a lot, and what I do is just dodge the first swing and then dodge into her on the second to get an almost impossible to miss shot off on her torso from point blank range. From here, she can do a few things, but my main goal is to get to far range again and reset the situation. The best option is for her to start rolling, and as long as I can avoid the initial damage, I get a great opportunity to shoot her from a safe distance and be completely safe from the attack she throws out as she exits the ball. I tried for a long time to dodge the untangle attack in close range after her roll, but I couldn't get it consistent enough to be comfortable with it, so I opted for running away instead. I also discovered that you can jump the untangle attack as you're running away from her if she winds up close to you. It's kind of dangerous and can be pretty tight depending on the distance, but it left much more time for me to retaliate than a roll otherwise would. Plus, it just looks really cool. As cool as that is, I think the coolest way that I was able to take advantage of an attack is when she swings her, centipede body as a weapon in a 2 or sometimes 4 hit combo. Turns out that the hitboxes on this boss are pretty accurate in this scenario, because as long as I stand in a certain spot after the first swing, I can safely fire off a shot and still have time to dodge left to avoid the second swing and shoot again. It only works in this really precise spot where her, centipede body is positioned away from me and is the last part of the body to swing. And it's very satisfying to pull this off. If I try to take this shot any closer or from any further away, I take the hit instead. It's my favorite part of this fight, at least for this run. Romina has a ton of gap closers, so the fight ends up dancing between mid-range and short-range constantly throughout, and looks pretty neat as a result. Because of that, I think that this fight wound up being my favorite out of this entire run just because of how she forced me to play. Phase 2 is nothing special though, and in fact winds up being quite a bit easier. The only really dangerous extra attack she gets is a big flying spin move, but it's much easier to consistently dodge than the spectacle of it makes it seem. Her other attacks just force her into a stationary position, and as long as I get out of butterfly explosion range, then it's open season for me. Now that Ramin is finally dead, I set a tree on fire for no other reason than because it looked at me funny, grab the remaining fragments from Anir Alim, and head back to kill Midra. For a skinny boss, this guy is refreshingly easy to hit with crossbow bolts. My lack of armor means that he can chunk my health pretty hard, and my resistance to his madness is brutally low. Midra's biggest weakness, though, is his obsession with lore walking, and that means he's easy to bully from mid-range while I back away. Most often he'll move in with his gap closer attack, but that's an easy dodge with an easy retaliatory shot, and an even easier run away to continue the pinprick torture of my soldiers' crossbows. His main threats are his ranged attacks, but with decent timing and movement, those are pretty simple to dodge. He's also rather fond of his spinning attack, which comes in two parts. First is the wind-up, which can be rolled away from pretty easily. Second is the true spin, and hilariously enough, you can just roll behind him and let his lean keep you safe. Pretty easy and very satisfying. Phase 2, though, is where it gets real, and the first challenge is to just dodge his nuke. Hopefully you're not in the middle of the arena, because that could make it pretty hard. After that, though, he's got quite a few more dangerous attacks that I've got to avoid, and it feels like if his laser hits me even once during its barrage, then I'm toast. He's got a few new extra dangerous melee attacks, has new follow-ups for his main gap-closing swipe, and he can continue to nuke the arena. And whatever you do, don't let your guard down during this nuke, or this could happen. Fuck you! God, I can't see through your bullshit, and you expect that to not one-shot me? I know you're expecting me to also wear armor and maybe a few more defensive talismans, but I don't know if that's exactly a reasonable thing to have to react to. A cloud of yellow piss smoke always obstructing my vision when I'm supposed to be able to read the boss's movements is not something that I really particularly enjoy, Miyazaki. Oh my god. Despite all that ranting, Midra was dead on the next attempt. It wasn't particularly comfortable, and it was much closer than I would have liked, running out of flasks completely at the end of it all, but other than the super annoying task of having to shoot the Twiggy Man a lot just to even start the boss fight, this encounter was an absolute delight. I got to learn how to better dodge this dude, and I'm pretty sure he's secured his spot as my favorite boss fight of the DLC. Unfortunately, though, the fun stops here. I decided to record this whole video in 2 separate batches, and before I got around to recording the second batch, I got sick, so I'm gonna sound sick for the rest of the video. I'm sorry if that bothers you, I can't help it. Remember about half an hour ago when I said I make a very wrong choice in Leda in Hornsent's questline? Well, now it's time for that to pay off, because it's time to face the gank squad. I guess I need to do more research or just help Leda kill Hornsent in the future, because now Hornsent hates me for stealing his thunder. Apparently, Hornsent has to be present for the kill for the quest to count, and silly me thought maybe just summoning him once would suffice. I'm gonna warn you all right now, this chapter is gonna get a little bit unhinged, because more than any run I've ever done, even more than the Briar armor, the rest of the DLC began to cause my brain to completely unravel. Like, am I the only one who absolutely hates this fight? Am I the only one that wishes that this thing didn't exist, or at the very least, that there were more interesting ways to interact with the way that this fight is thrown at you? Like, I teamed up with Hornsent while Leda was invading him, and we killed her. Why then does she stay absent for the rest of the game until this moment, and why in Marika's tits does Hornsent decide to help her? Sure, I may have robbed him of his revenge, forcing him to pivot elsewhere and find a worthy cause to point his blade, but why is it Leda of all people? Why help the woman that literally tried to kill you? And on her part, why would you let in an ally whom you've actively betrayed, knowing that he could turn allegiances on a dime? It makes no sense. And I know, me hogging the Mesmer kill is about on par with a hunter rolling need on that rare polearm that's best in slot for your arms warrior, and I totally respect Hornsent's choice to claim my head for himself as a result of that decision. After all, the killer of my killer is my enemy, or something like that. But with Leda? No. What this should have been is an impromptu invasion happening somewhere in Anir Elim. You know that big, wide-open area with one of those horned knights that piss weather all over the place, right before the site of grace in front of this fight? That would be the perfect place to force an invasion, despawn the Weather Knight, and force a duel with Hornsent as he tries to take back what is rightfully his from you. Hell, you could even lock the player in this arena until the invader is killed, still punishing the player for doing the questline wrong in a way that we know FromSoft just loves to do. But no, because I was dumb and I didn't outright kill this guy with Leda, he's decided to become the absolute bane of my existence in this moment, at the start of this encounter with the misfit band of rowdy adventurers that once called themselves allies under Miquella's charm. Thematically, I do love what this fight represents. The band is basically waking up from their servitude and figuring out where they belong in this whole messed up situation and picking sides based on the results of your haphazard questing. Ansbach and Tielier come to your side if you follow through with their quest lines, but if you complete Freya's quest line, she decides that she's done with you and tries to murder you. Yeah, that's totally worth a mediocre shield. Needless to say, I was smart about this one and didn't deliver Ansbach's letter to her, causing her to mysteriously die off screen, and causing me to thankfully not have to fight her. As for Moore, I told him to be sad forever and ever, and he went and curled up somewhere to die on his own, saving me the grief of having to deal with him in this fight. And it sucks that I have to make somebody feel so bad that they have to go curl up and die somewhere else, just to make this fight feel better. If you do everything right, then your only two opponents will be Dryleaf Dane and a Needle Knight Leda. They have about 16 and 17,000 health respectively, and each of them carries a flask to increase that by around 30 to 40%. I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's pretty significant. Especially considering that this is an NPC fight, which by all accounts really should follow the same rules as the player's stats, but I guess that's just not the game that we're playing. And yeah, I get it, our ability to outsmart the relatively simple AI should be worth increasing their stats by at least a little bit, but 17,000 health? With the ability to absolutely decimate my health, even if I were wearing armor? I'm sorry, what were the soft caps again? Look, my failure to handle Hornsent correctly is 100% on me. And at the very least, his health sits at only 10,000 and he doesn't have a flask. So if there's any silver lining with this situation, it's that. But even if I had done this correctly and had to fight only 2 characters instead of 3, this fight still would have made me absolutely lose my mind. I've been ranting long enough to show you exactly how this fight goes, and if you've been playing or watching this game for any decent amount of time, you know that NPC fights are the most dodge-happy morons in a 10-mile radius. You could throw a rotten peach in the trash and one of these dudes will detect the projectile from 3 rooms away and roll like a dumbass. It's absolutely infuriating. Oh, and I think that this is a great time to remind you that I'm on New Game +1. It's not a huge upgrade to the boss's stats, but it's worth at least 2 extra bolts of damage in health and defenses, all while increasing the amount of damage that I take by an unknown amount. It really shouldn't be enough to make the difference, but when you're struggling this hard, you find a way to regret everything down to the lunch that you had that day. The only way to get a shot off is to blast them while they're distracted with their own attacks or spells, and at least with Hornsent, it's not too difficult. His 2 biggest attacks that he loves to use both give an opportunity to hit, and there's a pretty decent chance that they'll crit and stagger him out of whatever he's doing. If he gets either of those moves off though, it's practically enough to kill me. His budget Carian Phalanx is not too difficult to cancel, but his weird rush is an absolute killer, and there was more than one occasion where he would just chain it until I died. If it was just him, that might be fine. So my main goal is to kill Hornsent as fast as possible. His defenses are pretty awful, so if I'm lucky and doing well, I can get him to about half health and poisoned by the time Dane spawns. From there, I have to get even luckier and hope that Hornsent tries to cast his spell while Dane is far enough away from me to let me get away with a shot. Dane, though, is absolutely relentless and just runs at you constantly. All of these NPCs do. They just don't let you breathe in the most infuriating way, and because they have cheaty AI reflexes, there's absolutely no chance to surprise them with a shot or gain distance with clever movement. Because of this, most of my attempts ended in abject failure before Hornsent had a chance to learn what the dirt tastes like. In the few rare cases that I am able to kill Hornsent in time before Leda spawns in to ruin my day, then it's still a wash. The way to play this as a projectile character is to simply run in circles and only take the most absolutely safe shots that you can, making 100% sure that you dodge any holy rage bait that either of them tries to throw your way. Unfortunately, someone on the FromSoft team decided that shooting a crossbow should take longer than swinging a wooden board with a toothpick on it, so most openings that look like openings are actually openings to smear my body so hard into the ground that my skin creates more sand in the arena. Even in the rare occasions that I have the space available between me and Leda to punish one of Dane's holy frisbees, it doesn't feel real because I have to react in time to sidestep the toss and hope that Dane doesn't magically reposition while I'm still recovering from pulling a trigger and have the return trip of the frisbee shave a few thousand hairs off of my thighs. And that all assumes that I can correctly triangulate the speed and direction that Leda is charging me from and determine whether or not I'm actually safe from any of her garbage. All the frustration that I felt from fighting Meter came back to me tenfold during my attempts of this fight. Based on my rant, you'd probably imagine that this took many hours off of my life, and you'd be right, but probably more through hypertension than the mere passage of time, because I regret to inform you that I cheated the hell out of this fight by my own challenge rules, and I would do it again. I tried to make it interesting. I tried to stay at least somewhat thematic, but unfortunately, there aren't any crossbow-focused summons. So I went to grab the Mimic tier, I went to collect enough upgrade materials to max it out, but homie just stood in the middle of the arena taking pot shots with a batting average that would make Bob Bergen swell with pride. The only thing that he was able to accomplish was making the NPCs vaguely nervous by spawning a projectile in a 2-mile radius, which, don't get me wrong, is useful in helping me keep my own distance, but absolutely worthless in helping me finish the fight. And on the off chance that the Mimic did land any kind of hit, then he basically just got pummeled into dust himself, leaving me alone and down a flask for no tangible benefit. I would even wait until after I killed Hornsent to bring him out because it was just that disruptive to the flow of combat. So I caved. I summoned Ansbach, I summoned Tiolye, I summoned my Mimic, I finished the fight, and I'm not happy about it. This fight can suck my left crossbow. It's mechanically such a garbage fight. Maybe it'd be okay if you could off these fools one by one while you're out in the world, but this encounter hinges completely on their individual quest lines. Because of the nature of these crossbows, I doubt that this fight will ever get harder than what I experienced here. And while yes, this was an absolutely maddening experience, it pales in comparison to what I ran into next. It's no secret that Radahn is hard. He's just a big beefy guy doing big beefy guy things, and unfortunately for you and I, that sometimes includes bullying people that are much smaller than him. And guess who's got 2 crossbows and a relative height of 3'2"? Hey, yeah, that's me, let's go! The discourse online about Radahn is so fascinating. In fact, discourse about this entire DLC is fascinating because it's so weirdly polarized in ways that I didn't expect after my own experiences. I think that there's a lot of valid complaints about how bonkers the movesets of some of these bosses are, but unless you're using a weapon class that lacks speed as much as it lacks damage, like crossbows, there's generally a lot more openings in these boss fights than I think most players are able to properly recognize. It's a high skill floor to engage with some of the bosses on their level, that's for sure, but with all the tools that this game offers to help mitigate some of the danger, I think it's mostly fine, and creates such a wide breadth of accessibility through gameplay in a really cool way. That said, this fight against Radahn is simply one of the most bafflingly overkitted movesets I think I've ever seen, and I used to play Smite. The amount of things this dude can pull out at the drop of a hat is enough to make anyone's brain melt into a puddle of rock and steel as Radahn throws everything he can in your direction, seldom giving you the time to breathe. Ignoring the presence of an almost completely undodgeable move that should never have made it through testing, and the extremely rare occasion where his corkscrew gap closer can one-shot you if you end up far enough away from him that his gap closer can't entirely close the gap, Phase 1 is mostly fine. Phase 2, though, is very much not fine, and not for the reasons that you might think. There's been a meme floating around about getting greedy in this fight, but the greed is doing 2 light attacks instead of just 1, and that's absolutely wild. This meme is sopping wet with the truth that Phase 2 Radahn has no chill. I've mentioned before that, especially for the DLC, you've got to use your attack windows as healing windows instead. You can't simply take a hit and expect the boss to let you get your ass up and chug a Sunny D. In most boss fights, that's fine. Bosses may hit hard, but in a majority of cases, especially if you're sitting at 80 vigor like I am at this point, you probably don't feel like you're at any risk of instant death if you're sitting over 50% health, even while wearing full heavy armor and the most offensive talismans I can get my hands on, which I did within the first 2 hours of attempts just to save myself a little bit of pain and sanity. In this fight though, nah, this boss feels like he can one-tap you from 80% at any given moment. And because of that threat, the urge to chug after getting smacked halfway across the arena by a two-handed bat swing with a force that would probably cause most of our frail human bodies to explode on contact is difficult to resist. But in a baffling move that's a huge middle finger to everyone who's encountered this fight, most of Radahn's openings are not viable to drink a flask through. If you try, you're liable to catch a sword to the face because his recovery time in between combos is simply that short in way more cases than feels reasonable. You have to wait for one of his biggest openings to feel like you even have the room to take a drink, and those instances of relative safety feel brutally rare. And in my case, where I'm desperately trying to juggle my reloading animation with the 30-pound trigger of these crossbows with the rapidly deteriorating poison status that I'm trying to build up, the last thing that I want to do is trade one of my biggest openings to get 2 whole shots off for a flask instead. It doesn't feel like an even trade. 11 hours. I always knew that these crossbows were awful. That was the entire point of this run after all. But aside from the NPC fights, they never felt quite as debilitating as they do here. Around 360 damage per bolt, a reload requirement, a firing rate that makes 70-year-old motorists look like they're going over the speed limit, and my seeming inability to not take chip damage that wears down my flask count, and you've got a recipe for insanity. I watched videos showing off Radahn's hitboxes, I watched how no-hit runs deal with the shadow clones, I watched guides that tell me to avoid attacks in ways that for some reason felt like they just didn't work for me, and I died over and over and over again to being sucked dry by all of that combined with the brutality of Radahn's undodgeable cross slash. That move is the single most infuriating thing about this fight. Getting one-shot by his gap closer is frustrating, but that's just a weird fluke. Getting caught in his flashbang nuke hurts, but it's ultimately my fault for being animation locked in an unsafe moment. Getting clipped here and there wears me out, but it's relatively small potatoes damage. But the cross slash doesn't just have my number, it has the whole damn theory of mathematics. Look, I'm not stupid. I know that this attack is technically dodgeable. You can block a swing, you can wear the Crucible talismans, you can do an extremely tight dodge at a hyper-specific angle with unforgiving timing while fast rolling, or you can get lucky with the elevation shenanigans of this arena. But I was either unable or unwilling to do any of that, perhaps out of stubbornness or perhaps to prove a point. All I know is that my success in these attempts hinged so delicately on Radahn's frequency of this attack through any given attempt. If he used it too much in Phase 1, I found myself with less flasks on Phase 2. In fact, I even managed to get a no-hit run of Phase 1 because he decided that he just didn't want to use this attack at all. Sure, he still killed me in Phase 2 on that attempt, but the fact that I was able to get a no-hit phase at all because of that makes me feel more frustrated than proud. This feels like Melania's waterfowl dance all over again, but somehow so much worse. And because of this attack, I think I discovered something about the buffering system that I hadn't heard anybody else talk about before. Radahn is a boss that can very easily punish panic rolls, and once you reach a certain level of skill with these games, your inputs become more and more deliberate. You're no longer slamming on the dodge button trying to desperately get out of the way, you're pressing it once because you know that's all you need. But it turns out that maybe in some cases, your inputs are too deliberate because, and please, dear viewers, correct me if I'm wrong here, if you attempt to buffer a dodge while you're in hit stun, and then get hit by another attack before that buffered dodge has the chance to resolve, the input gets deleted and you won't actually roll. This is the only explanation that I could come up with as to why I would so often get hit by so many of Radahn's attacks in Phase 2, especially in the moments where I could swear that I inputted a dodge. I think the main culprit is the light beams that follow his attacks. They hit at a weird timing that I guess perfectly coincides with my own reaction time in a way that the light beams hit me just before the next attack comes through, causing me to get hit by the more dangerous part of the swing. I think what's happening here is I'm buffering a dodge, getting hit by the light beam to cancel out the buffered dodge, and then not realizing it, causing me to get smacked. And this isn't just a problem with the cross slash, it's an issue with the entirety of Phase 2. It almost feels like that in these scenarios, if I tried to panic roll more, I might dodge better. I know that's probably a bit of cope, but hey, that's what it feels like. But yeah, 11 hours of learning and incremental improvement just to be snubbed by my inability to properly dodge an overtuned move again and again and again. The cross slash wasn't always the cause of my deaths, but the deeper I got into these attempts, the more frustrated I became, loudly cursing this pile of ones and zeros every time the RNG decided that it was time for a cross slash. I got in my own head about it, and what I determined is that Radahn, he's cheating. And if Radahn is gonna cheat, then so will I. Up until now, my strategy was to try and get Radahn poisoned as quickly as possible in each phase, then try to finish him off with a pile of normal bolts. I tried to incorporate blood bolts into the mix, but they just weren't ever going off due to the slow speed that I'm able to build status. But Radahn is canonically weak to a particular element that I told myself I wasn't going to use in my runs unless it's absolutely necessary. And here we are. 11 hours. 11 hours of bashing my head into a brick wall. 11 hours of learning the intricacies of this boss's moveset and how my weapon of choice fits into the dance. 11 hours of frustration leading to a point where I felt like I plateaued in my ability to do any better. So, I went back to the lands between, killed some gargoyles, rode a few coffins up and down some waterfalls, and found my way to the Lake of Rot, where I proceeded to farm for Aeonian butterflies for a new kind of bolt, the Rot Bolt. We all know how absurdly powerful Rot is in this game, and when I felt like I had enough of a surplus for a decent number of attempts, I headed back to Radahn and got this run. My first attempt with Rot was so close. I'd gotten pretty close a few times with poison, but I knew that if I had used Rot instead that I'd probably kill him in no time. And this attempt was proof. The fight itself was pretty sloppy, perhaps caused by the extra tension introduced by the fact that I knew if I fail enough times, I'm gonna have to go and farm for more Aeonian butterflies, and nobody wants that. But finally, after all my struggling, I knew that it was only a matter of time until Radahn was defeated. For the next attempts, I went back to using poison exclusively for Phase 1, and then when Phase 2 starts, my goal is to bait out a holy nuke so I can hot swap my poison bolts for Rot bolts. This makes Phase 1 take a bit longer, but it keeps Radahn's Rot resistance as low as it can be in Phase 2, while also giving me more room to make mistakes and lose attempts, because the last thing that anybody wants is for me to have to go back to the Lake of Rot to farm. And then finally, after a few more attempts, I hear that beautiful, beautiful sound. I can't believe how difficult this run wound up being here at the end. Despite the relative simplicity of the original run with these crossbows, this DLC pushed me far beyond what I expected from it. From once easy bosses becoming surprisingly difficult to the unmitigated horror of an NPC gankfest, and then culminating in the most brutal challenge I've done in this game so far with Radon. Wait, what do you mean I'm not done? Oh, I almost forgot the Shadow Tree avatar. Okay, there you go. You happy now? I killed Radon. Do you really think that was going to be a problem? Get out of here. Anyway, I'd go so far as to say that this run was so much more difficult than my Briar Armor run. And that's knowing how absolutely brutal the Fire Giant was for me during that saga. Sure, no boss took me literal hours to beat in the same way that it did with the Briar Armor, but not having to worry about finding decent attack windows and not having to reload goes a long way in making a fight feel much more doable. That said, despite my frustrations in this run, I'm feeling reinvigorated. I'm excited to find more interesting runs to bring you all, and I'm gonna try not to let the fact that somebody else did it first stop me this time around. Oh man, what a run. I can't wait to throw these crossbows into the trash where they belong. What a terrible weapon. Anyway, thanks to my patrons for making this seem like it was all worth my insanity, and thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.